Hello, good afternoon. My name is Norma Nieto, and I'll be facilitating our webinar today focused on App Modernization with Azure. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we get started, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. First, the session is being recorded, and the download link to the recording will be shared with you afterwards. Second, we will have live Q&A at the end with our presenters. To ask a question, please use the question feature on your GoToWebinar control panel, usually found at the right side of your screen. You can use the question feature during the presentation as well if questions arise while you're watching. For any questions we can't get to in our live session today, we'll be sure to follow up with you after the session. Now I'd like to introduce our presenters for today's session. First up is Mike Snell, who is our VP of Solutions Delivery here at CEI. He has over 25 years experience leading our teams in creating software that clients love, and he's led our solutions group for 18 years. Mike is a recognized thought leader and has led his team in the successful delivery of projects across nearly every industry using almost every technology that you can think of. Mike is also a published author and has written 8 books to date, including the Visual Studio Unleashed series and various Microsoft training kits. He hopes that after this, you'll buy his books and help him boost his Amazon ratings. Haha. Next up is Geoff Tewksbury. He's our principal architect here at CEI and an Azure thought leader. He's responsible for leading most of our onshore and offshore teams on big, complex engagements, of course, focused on Microsoft Azure, as well as SharePoint, Windows 8, ASP.NET, and mobile solutions. Geoff has over 16 years of experience in software development, architecture, and design, and a master's degree in information systems. Geoff is a Microsoft certified applications developer and a Microsoft Partner Technology Solutions professional. And last but certainly not least is Sandy Marich, our VP of Strategic Alliances here at CEI. He's responsible for initiating and developing CEI strategic partnerships to deliver successful enterprise solutions for our clients, of course, including our Microsoft Alliance. Prior to joining CEI, Sandy was a partner manager and business unit executive at IBM. Before I turn it over to Mike to get started, I'll just walk through the rest of the content that we're going to cover today. We'll talk about the business challenges and benefits that might drive you to app modernization. And Geoff will walk us through the app modernization journey to the cloud. We'll talk about an app modernization workshop and pilot. We'll share some case studies with you and tell you a little bit about CEI, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. All right, take it away, Mike.
All right, thanks, Norma. So we just want to talk a little bit about the business challenges that people face. We know that when we say modernization, it likely means that we're talking about older technology, right? Some of it in your organization is running fine and it was a great investment, but we know a lot of it, is legacy applications that are dated, they're less than secure, they're holding the business back from getting the things they've done at the pace they'd like to do it, right? And so that's where application modernization, starts to shine. And of course, having all that legacy data, really impacts the team too, right? People don't love working to keep older systems stitched together. They want to innovate. It can, really drive morale down and create dissatisfaction. You couple this with, the budget crunch. The dev teams are being asked to do more, but they're stuck, sort of keeping the lights on. It's hard to find the time and the money to build on the new capabilities. And of course, there's growing demand for those new capabilities across the enterprise, and the enterprise needs apps to support remote workers. They want to outpace their competition. They want to keep up with the ever-growing data explosion. All of these challenges, we believe, can be met with a modernization strategy that shifts from, we have to build and maintain everything ourselves to a, let's leverage the best practices already built for us in security, hosting, scale, tooling, applications, and more, to help us innovate and keep pace. And that's what we're going to talk about. And so the next slide talks about some of the business benefits that we can think of when we think of application modernization. So we want to think of the future state when we're embarking on something this big, right? So this is a modernization strategy, and you have to convince the business that they have a lot to gain by going through a little bit of pain here, right? So these are just some of the things that you should expect as a result of this, and each one has their own ROI. And you're going to see a lot of this benefits, in a greater detail as Geoff walks you through through some of the technical capabilities that help you realize some of these benefits. But we understand, we understand that a move to a modern cloud architecture can help you with things like limitless scalability, right? World-class durability and redundancy, the ability to fail over across multiple countries and continents, right? Have security that's built in, and you don't have to spend time worrying and thinking so much about it, right? That's a really big one, right? Lower your overall cost to build and support. And I really think as we get towards the bottom of this list, I think that's really where a lot of the bigger gains come too. You can leverage what's already been built for you, right? Whether it's the hosting infrastructure or the cloud, and take some of the guesswork out of it, but also some of the services that are available in like API management, IoT services, machine learning, AI, all of those things will help you modernize and secure and scale your platform. So I'll turn it over to Geoff next, and he can talk about some of the technical capabilities or some of the technical considerations when doing modernization. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Mike. So yeah, I wanted to build a bit off of what Mike was just saying there in terms of some of the drivers that we see customers facing and addressing when they decide to go ahead and modernize, and specifically when they decide to modernize within a cloud environment. I'm sure that some of you have seen some or many or maybe a few of these as well in your own organizations, but working our way left to right here, the first one we see oftentimes is data center contract expiration and hardware refreshes. And this can also be coupled with urgent capacity needs. So organizations find themselves in a position where they're outgrowing their data center, and they need to be able to scale to meet either additional demands on their current solutions or be able to enable new solutions. So we'll take a look at this a little bit later, but that's really where customers can see a benefit and an alternative as opposed to having to go through costly provisioning of new resource allocation within their own environments. Delivering applications faster. This is a big one. So many organizations find themselves with applications that were built maybe 10, 15 years ago, and this is what Mike was talking about those legacy applications. Those applications, I always say that if an application lives to be 10 or 15 years old, it's served its purpose. It is a successful implementation. But those implementations go stale over time, and they go stale over time for a number of reasons, either because customer demands have changed, business requirements have changed, and also they've been built up over so much time that it's very challenging to be able to put new features out quickly. That results in long release cycles, in which case it might be time to actually think about modernizing that application to address the current needs. We talked about urgent capacity needs. Heterogeneous workloads. Modern solutions are no longer based on just homogeneous software stacks. All right, so a lot of modern technologies and capabilities such as advanced analytics and AI, they require a lot of administrative knowledge and investment to support the underlying platforms. By leveraging cloud technologies, organizations can rapidly develop and experiment with these new platforms, and they can start to kind of test the waters and innovate with new ideas that they want to develop without having to do costly upfront investments. Security and compliance is an interesting one. I sometimes hear clients mention that they fear that cloud cannot be as secure as their more tangible on-premise environments, right? Some of us have the feeling that if we can touch it and see it, that by virtue is more secure. What I hope to kind of relay upon or kind of address throughout the presentation is that to achieve the same level of security offered by Azure and cloud platforms is oftentimes unmatched by on-premise environments, and it can be done so at a fraction of the cost. New business opportunities. So advanced and complex scenarios like machine learning and artificial intelligence, they provide a lot of new exciting and engaging ways that we can interact with our customers and provide new features as well. And then lastly, end of support. All right, so we have a lot of organizations that spend countless man hours and time and money, just as Mike said, keeping the lights on, right, throughout working through software upgrades and platform migrations. Anyone who's ever been through a SharePoint migration back in like the 2007, 2010 days certainly knows what I'm talking about there. And so with modern cloud technologies, we can actually keep pace with the evolution of these platforms with minimal investment on our end, right? We're going to allow the cloud platform to work through those upgrades for us. Now, one of the things that all these have in common is really a central theme of enabling organizational agility. And that's one of the concepts that I wanted to keep in our heads as we walk through the rest of the presentation, because that really is one of the primary goals, if not the primary goal of app modernization, right? Whether or not it's organizational agility in terms of being able to service our customers with new features and capabilities, whether or not it's the agility to keep up with our competitors, whether or not it's the agility to enable our workforce to work smarter and better. So on the next slide, and I think a lot of you have probably seen this if you've been involved in cloud technologies and Azure and things like that for a while, but this is really just kind of showing the spectrum of going from a completely on-prem environment all the way up to SaaS-based solutions. And so when we're working on-prem, as we know, we're responsible for everything: provisioning of servers, the rack, mounting those servers and racks, networking those, making sure that we are procuring our own redundancy, whether or not that's switches or routers or the servers themselves. So this can be quite an endeavor, especially when you start thinking about needing to support solutions that can support a global user base, all right? And so that's a very challenging and costly thing to do on your own. So one of the things that we see customers do, and one of the first moves that we saw, we went back 4 or 5 years ago, were customers moving more to infrastructure services within Azure. And this is where you're basically delegating the responsibility of the lower level infrastructure and virtualization of those servers to Azure, and you're focusing on just the maintenance of the VMs themselves. Now, where this is enticing is, again, you've now removed all your virtualization needs, your servers, and you've moved yourself up that OSI model in the stack to more working with the VMs themselves. Now, as you progress further to the right, we start looking at platform and serverless environments. So in platform and serverless environments, this is where you even further delegate out to Azure the responsibility for not only managing the underlying infrastructure, but also managing the environments and the platforms themselves that you'll be hosting your applications within. So you provide the applications and the data that you want to host, and Azure takes care of it, and it kind of abstracts away from you. Is this IIS? Is this Tomcat? How are we going to handle redundancy of our Azure, of our SQL environment? We can use platform services so that we can actually delegate that out to Azure and not have to worry about that ourselves. And then lastly, as you move all the way to the right, we look at software as a service. And this is where you're even stepping beyond the application and data itself, and you're really just configuring a solution for the needs of your organization. So things like SharePoint Online, Azure DevOps, and Microsoft Teams are great examples of that. And as we see, as you move to the right in each of these steps, it's a drastic reduction in the amount of responsibility and thus an increase in the agility that your organization can have as you want to bring new capabilities. So if we look at the next slide, I wanted to kind of match up some of the approaches and migration strategies that we see along with some of those triggers that we mentioned earlier. So, when we look at app modernization, it comes in an array of scopes and sizes, right? So not a one size fits all. Not every single app migration needs to be a complete re-architecture of your solution. It really just depends on the software capabilities and needs that your organization has. So let's talk about a couple scenarios that we've seen here at CEI. So in terms of a lift and shift, we had a client about 1.5 years ago. They were quickly running out of capacity in their on-premise data center. They had actually gotten to the point where they anticipated after about 5 or 6 months they would grow beyond their current capacity. And it was almost like, for anyone who ever watched the show 24 with the ticking clock, they were actually monitoring that to say, okay, well, this week we're at 62% capacity. This week we're at 64% capacity. It was inching up on them, and it caused them a lot of concern in terms of how we're going to grow and extend and how we're going to keep things running. So what they decided to do is rather than go through expensive kind of processes and upgrading their existing data center, or instead of re-architecting everything to now be kind of a cloud native solution, they decided to align themselves with Azure and extend their data center into Azure, and then start to port some of those critical VMs up into Azure and host them there, freeing up any kind of capacity they needed for their actual data center themselves. And this is a really common practice, and we see it all the time. And this is kind of one form of app migration or app modernization that you can consider. It really just depends, again, on the needs of the systems that you have. Containerization is kind of a step to the right here as well, and it provides a little additional flexibility. We did have a client who, they had a solution. It was a claims processing solution, and it was very complex. They had business rules that, millions of business rules that they would have to parse through for each claim that would come in. And when they originally wrote it 15 or 20 years ago, the model worked well. Basically what they had was a Windows service that was running on a VM, And as they ran out of capacity, they would just stand up another VM and reinstall that Windows service, and now they had 2 services, so they had double the capacity. But truth be told, that's not really a great allocation of resources, right? I mean, there's a lot of waste there in standing up entire VMs, and a lot of time to stand those up, to stand up entire VMs just to service the needs of that Windows service. So what we proposed there was, well, let's move that out of the Windows service and let's just do a small refactoring effort to port that over to a container. Now, by porting it over to container, they can now stand those things up in seconds rather than days to configure those VMs and get them into rotation. But they can also now make the best use of that computing capacity, right? They can now cram as many containers as they can onto a device, making sure they're actually utilizing the VMs that they're hosted on to their fullest capacity. Another thing that we see, by the way, when customers are looking at containers, and oftentimes this is when placed against looking at more serverless technologies, is some customers do find the need to want to stay cloud agnostic. They want the ability to be able to port their applications, whether or not it's in Azure or on-prem or other cloud providers. They don't want to feel like they're locked in, right? They don't want to feel like they have to rely on a particular vendor. And in those cases, containers can be an enticing option as well, as opposed to moving to serverless. And that really is more of a kind of it's kind of on a case-by-case basis in terms of what the strategy is for that organization moving forward in terms of their cloud strategy. PaaS and serverless, based on what I just said, if you can, though, get yourself to commit to a cloud-native approach and you can commit to a cloud provider, there are a lot of synergies that can be gained through cost and management efficiency, enhanced agility. So platform services and serverless environments, they provide an Azure-hosted managed platform for conducting and hosting your solutions. All right, so in the container world, you're still kind of managing that container infrastructure. All right, and you're still having to maintain the containerization yourself. Whereas when you move to platform, now you're extending to Azure the ability to actually host the environments with those are running on, and you're basically just consuming those kind of capabilities. So whether or not we're talking about cognitive services to add AI capabilities, whether or not we're looking at enabling high availability for, say, our eventing systems. We want low-code, no-code solutions such as logic apps, event-based architectures, and doing that all in a consumption-based model, that can be a very enticing proposition for customers. And oftentimes we see these serverless and platform services being used more in a re-architecture effort. So it's more than just re-platforming as it would be for an IaaS solution or even a container solution, but it's more a reimagining of how you host that solution in a cloud-native environment. So what I wanted to do next is just kind of talk about here at CEI some of the things that we see when we talk about modern cloud solutions, because they can be relatively complex, and there's a lot of moving parts, and there's a lot of things that we want to make sure that we're taking advantage of, so we're getting the most use out of our cloud environments. So this model is just kind of trying to show at the center we have our solutions and how those are constructed, but also these ancillary concerns that we should have as we're deploying out into our Azure environment. So as an example of an app today, right, that could be a hodgepodge of different Azure services that you're using. So you may be using cognitive services because maybe you want to do some image recognition. Maybe you're using app services to host your website, and maybe you have a event hub in there so you can actually do some eventing in between your different services. Maybe you're using some logic apps to do some workflow orchestration. You have some functions which are triggered off of certain events, and maybe you're leveraging Azure Search on top of all that with an Azure SQL database or a Cosmos database to house all your data. So those are a lot of different technologies that you're worrying about there. So there's some things that we want to make sure that we're addressing to ensure that when we are deploying these things and that we're hosting them and that we're constructing them, that we're doing it in a way that we still have visibility, we still have maintainability, and we have automation around that. So the first thing we'll talk about is security. And there's a number of different things in Azure that we can employ to help us with that. One of them, and one of the main ones, is Security Center. So Security Center is kind of your go-to stop for allowing Azure to scan your environment to look for potential threats and vulnerabilities. So you can use Azure, you can basically turn on Azure Security Center and start being notified in an opinionated fashion on things that Azure and the Microsoft team over their years and years of experience operating cloud environments have identified as potential threats. So things like, hey, you have open management ports on your VM, or we see anomalous login attempts on your Azure SQL database. And even further on Azure SQL database, you can enable something called SQL Advanced Threat Protection, which can look for things like SQL injection attempts, and it can ensure that you have transparent data encryption enabled. And there's a whole slew, hundreds and hundreds of different policies that can be configured based on your organizational needs to determine how you want to establish your security posture within Azure. Along the same lines, or a similar line, is Azure Sentinel. So Azure Sentinel is a SIEM, it's a security information event management system. This is basically a log management system that collects files and security alerts, events, and drops those into a central location that are geared more towards the needs of security professionals. By putting those in a central location, they now have a central area they can monitor additional threats outside of that of Azure Security Center. So you can, and it employs AI and machine learning behind the scenes to detect threats and vulnerabilities. It can help you do root causality and trying to determine what caused an actual security event to happen. You can then query all the information that's there within Azure Sentinel real time, and you can even create custom workflows to ingest that information back into your custom business process. So maybe you want to, in the event of a security event, log that back into your ITSM for further analysis. Now, those are more kind of administrative security features and more governance-related security features, but we also have some ones that are more tactical that come in from a day-to-day perspective when you're building solutions. So one of them that's worth mentioning that oftentimes gets overlooked is managed identities. So within Azure, you do have the option to connect to things via keys and things like that. So for storage accounts, say, we know that we can have an access key and we can have that access key and that basically a connection with that access key distributed out to other applications, maybe app services, so that our web app can talk down to a storage account. And the same is true for SQL and other services as well. Service bus as an example. But you don't necessarily have to do it that way. Now, there's risk in doing it that way, because as you start to distribute these keys across your development organization, now you have more and more developers that actually know and have access to these keys. And obviously, the minimum number of people that we have access to high level access to services like that have our sensitive corporate information, the better. We want to reduce that as much as possible. So an example that you can use here with managed identities, and most Azure services and many Azure services actually have the capability to employ these. You can go ahead and you can say, hey, my app service, I want you to create a managed identity for me. And that managed identity is nothing more than an Azure AD service principal, which is created behind the scenes. And whenever my app service attempts to connect to a SQL Server database, or whenever my Logic app attempts to connect to a service bus, I want you to use that managed identity. And then what we do is we can say, well, this managed identity, we want to have very granular permissions for it. Maybe my app service shouldn't have write access to storage. Maybe it should only have read access to storage. So I can actually take that managed identity, I can give it storage blob reader access instead of storage blob contributor. So now I'm using least privilege, and I have it in the model by which it's just scoped down to my service that has access to these things. And if my service goes away, my managed identity goes away, there's no credentials and no keys being kind of juggled by the development team. So in that sense, it's a lot more secure. It's a much better way of trying to interconnect some of these systems securely. Key Vault is another one. In instances where you can't use managed identities, again, we don't want these keys to be spread throughout the organization. So Key Vault provides the ability to store sensitive information in a secure manner, kind of away from the larger development team. So this could be database passwords, SFTP passwords, other certificates that you have. What it does is it actually stores these keys in an HSM that you can grant access to only the appropriate individuals. Another one that we see oftentimes is privileged identity management. So from a security perspective, rarely would you want individuals to have persistent access to production resources, right? We shouldn't have individuals that have contributor access to our production resource groups in Azure per se. But however, sometimes it's required, right? Like there are times when we need to do hot fixes and we just need to get someone in there to make a change. What privileged identity management allows you to do is enable automated workflows for requesting temporal access. So if I as a developer say, listen, I need to get into this environment because I need to put a hotfix in, I can actually request through privileged identity management, or PIM, access to a resource group or a particular resource and even an entire subscription for a given amount of time, say 4 hours. At that point, either through automated workflow or through someone's explicit approval, I'll be granted that access, but then PIM is ultimately responsible for tiering out that access after that 4 hours has expired. So what this does, it alleviates some of the problems that we've seen where organizations have a lot of stale credentials that are hanging around for different resources. And everything's audited as well, so you have a full audit trail in terms of who's had access to what and when. Azure policies. So we don't talk about governance all that much in this presentation, but Azure policies are a very important aspect of that, and they do help us quite a bit out with security. So when you're thinking about your Azure environment as it grows, it becomes very hard to ensure consistency. And corporate governance and security standards become challenging, right? If we're leaving that up to individuals to manage themselves, if we literally have people whose responsibility is to start sifting through Azure and start figuring out who has access to what and what's been deployed and when was it deployed and all those sorts of things, that's extremely challenging. That's going to become impossible to keep up with as your environment grows. So what Azure policies do, they allow you to configure guardrails within your Azure environment. And what these guardrails allow you to ensure corporate and government compliance. So for instance, you can have policies which say, we're going to block or audit any deployments of SQL that don't have advanced protection enabled, right? We're working with sensitive information, so we're going to enforce you to have that. And if you try to install a SQL instance that doesn't have it, we're either going to flag it and notify you, or we can also optionally just block you from doing it. You can't even deploy it. You can audit deployments of unapproved resources or SKUs. Maybe we don't want GPU level VMs being deployed into our environment, or maybe you want to ensure that any resource that's deployed into an environment is within a particular region within Azure. Those are very easily achieved with out-of-the-box policies in Azure. Maybe we want to enforce tagging standards, all right? Maybe we want to, or maybe we want to automatically apply tags, right? Maybe we say that for any resource that's within this subscription or this environment, we want to attribute those to a particular dev team or a particular cost center. So while Azure policy goes beyond security and just across the board in terms of governance, it is important to note that it is a central player in making sure that you have a guardrailed environment from a security perspective. Now, the next tier out that we see outside of security is monitoring. And in conjunction with diagnostic settings and activity logs that Azure provides, this allows DevOps teams to send all subscription and activity log information to a central and queryable location, right? So the great thing here is that all the Azure resources that we have, we can actually inject into a central log analytics workspace, or if you need to, multiple log analytics workspace. And by the way, if log analytics isn't your cup of tea, you can actually have it stream information out to your own management log analytics management tools. So if you're using something like Splunk, or if you have other SEMs that are out there, you can actually stream those logs out there. Now, interestingly, we've worked with a number of customers on kind of a monitoring platform, and I'll show you that here on the next slide to just give you a little bit more information on how we set those things up. But lastly, if you're going to be working in the cloud and you want to see true agility, it's critical that automation be first and foremost in your mindset. And that's not only our coded artifacts, that's not just our .NET and our JavaScript projects, but that's also the environment upon which these solutions are hosted. Right? So this includes the deployment of Azure resources and everything that we've just talked about, alerts and monitoring, security, our policies, our configuration security center, all those things can be automated. And by taking that out of individuals' hands and by stopping from actually deploying things live through the Azure portal, we get a lot more consistency and a much more secure environment with which we're deploying it. You know, some of the tools that we use here, I'm sure some of you are familiar with, things like Azure DevOps, creating ARM templates, or maybe some people prefer Terraform, which is great. But also looking at some other tools as well. So if we start looking at GitHub, GitHub now has native support in GitHub Actions for CodeQL. So being able to do vulnerability scans, not at the time of running the solution, but actually at the time of build, all these kind of tools allow you to kind of shift left, right? Detect these software defects and vulnerabilities early on in that development process. Some additional considerations that we typically have that aren't as prominent on this slide here. What are my SLAs for my solution? How am I going to build my solution so that I can host it across multiple regions or achieve the level of business continuity that my solution needs? How am I going to address regulatory compliance? Luckily for us, Azure actually has a number of out-of-the-box blueprints that we can use, which will actually go ahead and apply policies, a number of policies which help us to be PCI compliant, NIST compliant, or you can even create your own blueprints for your own compliance needs. Organizational cloud governance, again, how do we enable our teams to be self-sufficient while balancing that with ensuring that we're keeping within our regulatory and our organizational as well as government regulatory needs? And finally, cost management, right? How do we get around, or how do we get to a point where we have very granular information about the cost of our Azure environment, what those costs are attributed to, and be able to be notified of those if we see that our budgets are starting to be, if we have budgets that are starting to fill up, right? If we're getting to the point where we're close to what we would anticipate spending for a given month or a given week or whatever it might be. So to summarize this, when we talk about cloud environments and Azure specifically as well, when you hear people talk about modern data centers, it's more than just deploying and migrating solutions to the cloud, right? It's really those that exercise those ancillary capabilities, the security, the monitoring, the automation, the governance, the cost management, that are really seeing the full benefits of cloud modernization. On the next slide, I just want to give a picture of what we mean when we talk about kind of an enterprise monitoring architecture. So there's a couple things to think about when we do this. One is that we have different teams that are involved. We have line of business teams. These are our DevOps teams that are in charge of managing day-to-day operations of our solutions and building those solutions. But we also have those that are responsible for the overall cloud environment. So one of the first things we like to do is we like to set up so that we actually have the activity logs from all Azure subscriptions going into a log analytics workspace. And what this allows us to do is track things like service outages in Azure, policy nonconformance, any recommendations that come through Azure Monitor and Azure Advisor, and any security events that come through Security Center. An example of this, by the way, that's interesting, and by the way, all activity, like all the configuration changes that are made in your environment, come through those activity logs. Now, an interesting example of how we use this in our environments are, let's say that we already said we want to make sure that everything is automatically deployed. We don't want to be manually deploying things through the portal. So one of the alerts that we typically will set up is we'll say, okay, well, now that we have all the configuration changes in log analytics, we can write a really simple custom query which will notify us if there's been a deployment or a change to a production environment that was done by anything other than DevOps, because we'll know that the service principal didn't come from DevOps, therefore we can alert on that. The other side of this is that so that's more for the overall team, right? That's for the team that's managing the environment and making sure the environment is being used the right way. But what about those line of business, those DevOps teams, and how do we help them out? Well, not only do we want to provide them with the logs from the activity logs so they can keep track of service outages and things, but we also want them to be more tactical. We want them to have information about how their specific applications are running. So things like, why did my data factory pipeline not run when I expected it to? Why did my logic app fail? Why am I getting 500 errors on my website? We can collect all this information into a central location so that the team has the full context and they can query across different resources to find the root cause of a problem. Now, one thing I did want to mention on the next slide is microservices. And we're not going to get in depth on microservice architectures, but if any of you are familiar, it is and it can be an extremely powerful tool and a means of decomposing a software solution so that teams can build at scale. And they work, and we've worked with a number of clients in building out microservices solutions. But that being said, many teams that we've spoken with also kind of see microservices as synonymous with app modernization, right? So when we start talking about app modernization, they say, okay, well, first step to app modernization, let's think about how we can mold in microservices into our architecture. And the one thing I want to leave in terms of microservices here is, again, while it can be an extremely powerful tool for the right use cases, you do have to make sure of one thing, and that is that your architecture should reflect your IT organization, right? What we mean by that is that sometimes DevOps is seen as an afterthought, and it's kind of on the side. We build a software solution, we say, okay, let's build some DevOps around it. But what we really need to be doing is aligning the way we build software and the way that we architect software with the way that our IT organization is going to run it. And this is actually not an idea of CEI. This is actually a long and held principle that was coined by Melvin Conway. So it's called Conway's Law. So it's the idea, again, that our software architecture should mirror our IT organization. So with this in mind, we just want to caveat that microservices are a very powerful tool, and they work well in scenarios where we have autonomous teams that can deliver separate solutions that can then be constructed as a whole, and that can really gain a lot of synergies within an organization. However, if you're more in a situation where you're working with a smaller team, maybe 2 or 3 people, and they're going to be maintaining a solution, you might want to consider some of the consequences of the microservice architecture as well, because that can be more complex and actually can cause them more work on their end. So on the next slide, we just want to really touch upon kind of AI and cognitive services and app modernization. So that to me is one of the more exciting and transformative opportunities for cloud, and kind of more exciting around the types of solutions that you can build and offer to your internal organization as well as to your customers. So first off, engaging in new ways with your customers. So things like natural language processing and intelligent conversational bots provide us with new avenues of working with our customers. Empowering employees, right? So making sure that, and using tools like, collaboration tools like Microsoft Teams, Azure DevOps, and even Visual Studio Code Spaces, providing cloud platforms such as Cognitive Services, Databricks, and Kubernetes services. These all allow teams to not only collaborate together more effectively, but also to prototype and validate ideas in days rather than in months. Optimizing operations. So by removing and offloading manual operations to automated processes. So as an example, we've been talking with a lot of customers recently about Microsoft's new form recognizer and RPA platforms. And what this does is it provides an AI-based solution to understanding structured electronic documents, so things like invoices, tax forms, things like that. So we can use form recognizer and automated workflows to actually grab the data that's in those documents, pull it out, and actually move it through a pipeline where we can either ingest that into a back-end system, or we can store that in data lakes for further analysis down the road. And that really removes the need for people to be hands-on keyboard doing some of the more mundane data entry tasks. And lastly, the transformative product. So using tools like Cognitive Services and AI, they allow the masses to entertain new capabilities, right? So this providing things like additional insight for customers and providing those new features to customers that are based on machine learning and AI that can be really game changers for a lot of organizations. Now, I will say the nice thing about Cognitive Services is that sadly, I am not and will never be an expert in the inner workings of machine learning. So now we do have machine learning experts here at CEI that help customers out with custom machine learning algorithms all the time. But as an architect with my background, when I hear people talking about machine learning algorithms like learning vector quantization and classification and regression trees and k-means clustering, I get lost pretty quickly, right? But now the good thing is that I don't need to be an expert in order to be able to use those capabilities. So thanks to things like Cognitive Services, the lack of depth doesn't preclude me or others to be able to bake things in like image recognition, speech recognition, text-to-speech and speech-to-text, natural language processing, cognitive search and contextual search. These are all things that we can use as simply as just integrating with HTTP endpoints. We can simply, in order to get some context around an image, we can simply call an HTTP endpoint and we can retrieve back information about that image. So those are exciting things that we can start to think about in terms of how do they apply to our organization and our solutions. So again, I know that was pretty quick and we ran through that very quickly, and there's a lot of detail in there we didn't cover, but again, the idea here is that looking at cloud, the main focal point here is to increase our agility and to be in a position to be able to provide solutions more quickly, both to our internal users as well as back to our customers as well. So I think now we just have a few case studies that we wanted to run through with you guys in terms of some success stories that we've seen in App Modernization. So the first one here is a case study around an outage management system. And we worked with Duquesne Light and Duquesne Light's team to build this. So they had an older, a legacy mainframe solution for this originally. And there are some concerns about whether or not the SLAs to maintain that would be sufficient for their needs. All right, so the outage management system, this is very much a system that manages when there's power outages due to storms or things like that, and they need to be able to address those issues. They need to be able to record them, put people out in the field to fix these issues. They need to be able to respond to customers in terms of, yeah, we anticipate service will be back in within a couple hours or a couple days or whatever it might be. So what we did was we dissected that solution and we built it into a cloud-native solution. It was based on an Angular front end that was used by customer service reps as well as the folks who work on the ground there at Duquesne Light to actually service these outages. And we built a number of different services that made that up. Much like that slide where I talked about the modern app, where we have a number of different services that we use a number there. We used App Services and Traffic Manager. We used serverless Azure Functions. We tied some things together with API management. We use Azure SQL Database with geo-replication enabled to make sure that we could handle any kind of failover. And we used also multi-regional Cosmos databases. Now, the whole idea here was that we needed to make sure that we had at least 4 nines of availability. So at every single tier in that solution, we made sure that we were redundant, so there was no single point of failure. And Mike, I think you had a couple of case studies as well that you wanted to walk through.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you, Geoff. That was really good. So, and I won't spend too much time on this, but I just wanted to point out a couple things. So, it's really cool to be able to work for a Major League Baseball team, especially, a local one like the Pirates, but they too are a business, right? And the Pirates had a legacy on-prem SQL database that was crunching numbers and doing their sabermetrics analysis. This was a scouting application, and it was front-ended with a legacy Windows application. So the scouts couldn't get the data they wanted, they couldn't visualize it, they had trouble getting the answers to the questions they wanted, and they had to access it through a desktop or a laptop. So that was kind of painful. So what we did is we came in, we helped them move to Azure, where they could leverage the power of big data by building out an Azure data lake, and they ingest the data, clean it, crunch the numbers, and then create an API that we could then access with a mobile-friendly web app that then the scouts could use from their phone or their tablet to quickly get the information they needed from anywhere in the world. So another great example of modernization. The next case study that we have here is from Altria. Altria is a group out there in Richmond, Virginia, known for the tobacco industry, if you will. But it's an interesting case study, and I brought it in here because they took advantage of an offer that we're going to chat about with you here in a moment. We did an Azure workshop with them, and that allowed us to quickly demonstrate how we could move their application and their source code into Azure following best practices. So in just a few short weeks, we're able to get them set up, working and deploying their web applications and their web development in Azure following best practices, of course. All right, so let's move ahead and we'll talk about that offering a little bit with you. Not going to spend a ton of time on this. I just have one slide, but our App Modernization Workshop, it's a hands-on session. We get together with you and your team to workshop and demonstrate how you can take a legacy workload to the cloud and take advantage of modern capabilities that Geoff has been talking about here. It starts with a basic assessment in which we identify a possible workload as the target of the workshop. We then sit together, or virtually nowadays, in a workshop setting to talk. We want to talk architecture, we want to talk services that might be applicable to modernizing and innovating on this workload. And that's another thing. When we say modernization, it doesn't mean just a complete lift and shift. That helps, but a lot of times it's what are the opportunities to really innovate in this workload. So once we have our plan, we then again work with you and your team to pilot as much of the workload as we can directly in an Azure tenant. So with this, it includes setup, build out, configuration, migration, and even development if necessary. So you're left in the end with both a working sample of your workload running in Azure and a roadmap towards greater cloud enablement and, of course, innovation. Of course, timelines vary on these types of engagements. We typically see these as anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks. I mean, it all depends on the workload, right? Some can be shorter. Some are just a few short days. 5 days, you can get a good understanding of what you need to do. And then some large corporations where they're really charting a larger sort of overarching strategy, or they're building a product at the scale that you saw there with Duquesne Light and others. These are 6-month or year-long projects, right? So it really depends. This workshop is really targeted to those workloads that can sort of fit within this time window. Anyways, next I'm going to turn it over to Sandy to talk a little bit more about how you can engage with us directly on this workshop or otherwise. So thank you for that.
Hi,
thanks, Mike.
Sandy, I'm going to interrupt you. Before you start, we're really close to the end of our time, so I just want to say if people have to drop off, that you will receive the recording to this link, and we'll keep them. We're going to wrap up in the next 5 minutes, but we'll keep open for Q&A. So if you can stay with us, we'd love to have you. If not, we'll follow up with you. All right, Sandy, thanks.
Thanks, Norma. Mike and Geoff, great jobs on the presentation and leadership in these sessions. Just a little bit about us from a CEI perspective. We're a highly focused team of 600 folks that I always tell Geoff and Mike and our customers that we handle the tough problems, right, across the enterprise. So we're creative. We have a very collaborative team that really is focused around modernizing and integrating applications across your business and enterprise, and specifically around Azure. So just a few stats and facts about us from a Microsoft perspective. We've been a partner since 2004. We're certified in the following areas: Azure, of course, with Geoff's expertise and Mike's team's expertise. We deliver also Azure sessions to individual clients so that they can learn a little bit more about the services and what things to turn on and off as they go through their transformation journey. We're known as a DevOps lead partner within Microsoft. So when Microsoft sees us, they see us from an application modernization and DevOps perspective. From a data area, we're also gold. We believe in the importance of delivering the right data at the right time to the right place, so that you can have the right data from a competitive perspective. So we are gold in the Microsoft data and AI space, and Geoff spoke a little bit about that. We also are experts within application integration. So as we talk, and as Geoff talked about application modernization, and you review your applications across the board, you will need to consider data and application integration. Also, from a stats and facts perspective, in 2019, we were rated 17th among 100 national systems integrators within Microsoft, which shows our credibility, within Microsoft. We're minority certified, if that's important to you. We have locations that are across the U.S. We have a corporate headquarters, of course, in Pittsburgh, but we have sales, technical, and operations throughout the U.S. We also have nearshore and offshore capability in Peru and in India, so that we can be cost effective in some of these projects. You should also be aware that we have a team that can operationalize your strategy. So as you go through this as is to be, we have a team that can operationalize that. And under Justin McCaldy, we have a innovative thinking and design team that can create new applications in your market. As the market changes, you change. So it's kind of exciting at CEI right now. And as you probably well know, with COVID, the need for e-commerce requirements and the business landscape changing in your area, we believe, CEI believes, that application modernization area will be key for you to adapt to this new environment. So let's go on to the next slide, please. So what I'd like to tell you is a little bit about the offerings we have, right? So in speaking with Geoff and Mike, I thought, let's put something together that can assist our clients and our customers across the board in the area of modernization. So we have a 6-week modernization hands-on workshop that's around $25K, but it can be modified to meet your needs, whether small or whether large. We have a pilot cloud modernization to fit any particular purpose. So some folks are interested in cloud modernization from a lift and shift perspective. Some may look at cloud modernization as, how do I prioritize my applications? Which ones should I modernize that are most important to the business? We go through that with you. And then, of course, we build a cloud roadmap for enablement and modernization and innovation. So those are 3 offerings. I asked you, just to challenge us, and you can email me directly, call me directly, and we're willing to listen to your business and, of course, the outcomes you desire. So that's a short run through about us and our relationship with Microsoft, and I'll give it back to Norma. Norma?
Great, thank you, Sandy. So at this time, we're going to do some Q&A. We do have some questions from the audience, so thank you to those of you who did submit. You can still ask questions if you like. So our first question is, let me open this up. Is there still a role for ESB or traditional middleware in modernization in comparison to microservices?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And in fact, we've actually integrated middleware solutions in with these more serverless event-driven platforms. So whether or not we're talking about ERPs or other middleware integration solutions, oftentimes they can go in tandem, right? So for instance, we were working with a client that was, what was it? They had a point of sale system, and their point of sale system was distributed across, I think, across the entire US. I think they had something like 2,000 of them. Now, they had a couple of needs. They had a need whereas they needed to make sure that information that was being pushed through those point of sale systems would actually be able to integrate with the back end, but they also wanted to do it via an event-based architecture because they had had a lot of problems with more batch type processing in the past. So I believe they were using MuleSoft. And what we did was we came up with an architecture by which we had a more of an event store model where we had an event store architecture at each of the locations, right? So we're tracking every single event that came in through for a purchase or through a transaction. And then we would stream that out through Kafka out to a plugin or an adapter that in MuleSoft would then suck that information into that central location. So I don't think by any means is cloud a replacement for those types of solutions. Oftentimes they can go hand in hand. But that being said, there are times when you want to consider whether or not a big middleware solution is the correct solution, or whether or not the agility of something more like logic apps and something more like event-driven architectures using things like Service Bus are more appropriate. It really depends on the use case.
Great, thank you, Geoff. We hope that answers your question. If not, we'll follow up with you. And then we have one more question. What are the strategies in Azure for hybrid and/or multi-cloud modernization?
Yeah, interesting. So there's a couple of things you can look at. So from the automation perspective, we do see people making a lot of use of Terraform nowadays. So traditionally in Azure, we're deploying everything via ARM and ARM templates. But if you want to basically have a ubiquitous language by which you can deploy across multiple platforms, Terraform is your friend. There are also other strategies as well where people are trying to have a multi-cloud environment for things like at least this is what I've seen, for things like VM hosting and redundancy. All right. So if you're looking, I don't know if the question is more geared towards if we want to have a redundant model where we can have scenarios where I've got my main areas focused in Azure, but as a failover, we maybe want to go to on-prem or AWS or things like that. There are a lot of tools to do that. So, and there's actually some really exciting ones. So I'm not sure if you're familiar, but Azure Arc is one of them. That was one that was announced at Build last year, not this previous Build, but last year. Azure Arc is a platform that actually enables you to run Azure-like services on your own hardware. And it's not Azure Stack, by the way. So if you're familiar with Azure Stack, that's an actual hardware appliance that's actually wired into Azure. And that's a pretty big investment. But what Azure Arc allows you to do is, like, I'll give you an example. Let's say you want to run Azure SQL Database. You really enjoy and you're really attracted to the redundancy of it, the fact that it has built-in high availability, that it's got backups and everything managed for you. But you want to run it in an environment that's redundant outside of Azure. You can actually use Azure Arc, and you could even configure EC2 instances in AWS if you want to, and run Azure Arc on those, and then you could actually deploy Azure SQL Database as a service onto those VMs. And then you could use it as any other Azure SQL database that you would see. You would actually see it through your portal in Azure, and it would act, breathe, and feel just like an Azure SQL database would. There are also other times when maybe you need to use a different tool for the job. So maybe for some reason there's a service within AWS, or maybe in another cloud provider, or maybe on-prem that you need to integrate with. So in those instances, sure. I mean, and some of these things are in the open source model where we're using Kubernetes and we're using things like Kafka. Those are great instances where you're not locked into any particular cloud implementation. You can find the tool that works best. But those are interesting scenarios, and there's oftentimes a lot of detail that would need to be sorted out in terms of what would be best for a company. So it'd be interesting to know more about kind of the scenarios that you guys are thinking about, and what might be appropriate.
Thanks, Geoff. Well, that's all the time we have for Q&A, since we're already over a little time. Before we close, we'd actually like to remind you that we have an additional rest of our 6-pack of summer series. So these are what's coming up if you're interested in Azure, And Microsoft, we have DevOps on July 2nd. We have some further in-depth stuff around customer data with the Azure Data Platform. We also have our, Sandy mentioned human-centered design, so we'll be featuring Justin Mercaldi that he mentioned. He's an amazing speaker on human-centered design and provides some practical insights onto that. And then wrapping up, Cloud Center of Excellence, and we'll talk about RPA to close the series. After this, we will send everybody the link to the recording and that you can use to review, share with others in your organization. And we may, we'll send out the deck as well if you're specifically interested in that. And we'll include links to register for the rest of our webinars if you like. If you're interested in getting started on App Modernization, with one of our workshops or in general to pursue it with your organization, please reach out to Sandy Marich or your favorite CEI account executive. Have a great afternoon. Thank you for staying with us through the end, and we hope you'll join us again soon. Thanks.